I'm at the bank making money, making moves. Machines with tools and drills, making grooves. Missions impossible.
What is up, investors? Welcome back to In the Green with Charlie. Today, my guest is Dr. and investor user Mohamed Mohamed. He tells the story of his investing career and uses his background in medicine to give a unique perspective on the future of the markets. Here is our conversation.
Hey, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. All the better for being on the interview with yourself.
So could you start by just giving us a brief introduction to who you are?
So my name is Mohamed Mohamed. I'm 40 years old. I qualified as a doctor in Scotland in 2002 and have been specializing in emergency trauma and upper gastrointestinal surgery ever since. That was me once upon a time. Somewhere along the way in my career, probably around 2013, 14, I've always been a bit of like I said, a computer kind of person, sort of into programming and the sort of whole Bitcoin world and it just happened that I had a collection of graphics cards that sort of died on me every year that were lying around that were sort of semi-functional, and that kind of got me into a world of markets, if you like. It wasn't a good world back in 2014. There's a lot of, if you wanted to sort of buy and sell Bitcoin, sometimes you actually have to go meet somebody in person and sort of swipe your card, and then you sort of hear these odd stories about people sort of being taken advantage of and things. And I guess that's where I kind of was. I sort of thought Bitcoin was left in the realms of people like me who'd sort of hang around those types of forums talking about code and hash rates was excitement. And I then accidentally sort of left the pile, which I won't lie, did me well. However, I genuinely thought that when the price hit $10,000, that this was absolutely madness and a bubble was going to burst. So I kind of sold that halfway on the top, but at least I came out winning.
So one question I had that I was curious about, did you ever go and meet someone to trade Bitcoin, and what was that experience like?
So yes, I did. Actually, it was one person, and it only ever became the one person. And so I was insisted to be a public place, and I just said I'd rather not. It looked like two people swipe two mobile phones past each other and walk off. I have to say I was incredibly paranoid at the time. I really had no idea whether there's a lot of bad publicity associated with Bitcoin at the time. Whereas I was just seeing the potential that the tech community that was talking about. But I genuinely felt that I was doing something that was at odds with the sort of morality of my profession. And so those outings sometimes felt a bit like I was dicing with the General Medical Council's sort of regulations and things. But I think that was just me being overcautious. So I met this guy and I insisted that we sit and at least sort of have a drink and a 5-minute chat. And I was very fortunate in that this was a very sort of genuine guy, and he was sort of widely available. I did have to maybe use one or two other people in the interim, and if anything, it was them that insisted on the I'll give you the wink, we'll walk past, we'll swipe phones and we'll keep on moving kind of thing. And there's no time to sort of blink and check and make sure that the transaction's gone. You have to do that after you've taken a few steps away. It's a bit nerve-wracking because I was trying to buy $100 worth of Bitcoin at the time, and these people are trading several thousands and tens and thousands of dollars of it. So I just didn't know what they made of me, whether I was there to waste their time or there's value in their interactions. But I was fortunate that I had one person who I was able to kind of access frequently.
That's crazy.
It was, and I think some people still sort of prefer this sort of peer-to-peer approach. But I would warn anybody against it. the argument's always that the rates are a bit more competitive than what you would get on an exchange. But that comes with risks, and then I think with the sort of proliferation of technology and things, I'd be worried that somebody can maybe scan your phone and sort of maybe not actually send a transaction.
Gotcha. So moving on to focus on the stock market now, how has your experience as a doctor shaped where you think the future of the market is going with COVID and everything?
It's taught me that, well, it's taught me something that I knew, but I guess I never felt it so much, that there's always a disconnect between the reality of the world that we are living in and experiencing in, and the world that is portrayed by the financial metrics of the stock markets and the numbers that come from it. It also, for me, has really highlight. I think Hunter Berg is from his interview. I remember he's sort of very big on behavioral psychology and investment, and it's been fascinating to see what I think is probably a degree of hysteria from the virus reflecting itself in the markets, and some of the well, I guess you can say the rise in some stocks is actually been irrational. It's made me realize that planning for the long term based on financial matrices and geopolitical and macroeconomic events is no longer enough. There was always this sort of one little caveat, a medical disaster, but we'd been fortunate to avoid one. And if anything, when SARS happened, corporations were very quick to attack the WHO for declaring the pandemic too early. And if anything, that led to the WHO ultimately changing their criteria for what is defined as a pandemic. And arguably, that may have delayed things this time around. But what I did realize, I think the single most important lesson, and it's now shaped the way I invest, is the important investment is people. It's not the stock, it's not the company per se. All of these things are physical, but they are meaningless without the people within the company that make it work. So knowing about the management and knowing a bit about their tales of turning some things around or making some things work, making sure that the general economy is in good health, because the average consumer is one of the biggest contributors to GDP. And so really, the sort of fight for managing coronavirus and its sort of social side and public awareness, in a way, became synergistic with, personally, what I believe is the long-term recovery of the stock market. And I think that's been sort of mirrored in some little snippets or statements that you've maybe heard from individual Federal Reserve heads from various states. So yeah, I think biggest lesson is it's people that they're in the investment. They can take what is a garbage company and turn around. I guess a good example would be Eastman Kodak. They went from, I still remember the Polaroid camera, which is a relic now, to a chemical engineering company with a several $1 million grant from the government. So yeah, it's these types of things that make me think, well, it's not so much the company, it's the people behind the company that are doing work that can take this through to another level.
So what is your opinion about the likelihood and how bad a second wave could be?
So this is where I will make a disclaimer. So this is not based on anything that's sort of popularly corresponded to us as doctors in the NHS. It's not based on any evidence that I may be privy to before everybody else. It's all from information that is in the public domain. I guess where I have an advantage is I can translate what is even hard for us as doctors sometimes to read into sort of a more tangible English. I think the chances of a second wave are in the 70s to 80%. And on a bad day, I'd say 100%. I would even argue as far as saying that we may have made some grave errors in the very beginning, assuming that this was an outbreak that started in China and spread around the world, where increasingly genomic sequencing is telling us that maybe outbreaks started sporadically in several countries, several weeks before the first patient in China. And there's been an argument that the first case in the United States was actually diagnosed in January. And that's interesting because what I think is happening in the United States is rather than having a first wave and then a lull and a second wave, I think what's happened is you've had a first wave and a second wave that's coming into it. But if we look around Europe, so Spain, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, more recently Italy, have all been reporting over 1,000 cases, new infection cases per day over the last 10 days or so. Because the virus multiplies exponentially, once you have 1,000, you're really looking at 10,000 as your sort of next sort of stop point. And this is where you hope government measures kind of slow down spread. But within a week, France went from 1,000 to 2,500 cases. So it's fair to say slow down measures aren't quite working there. I accept the point that a lot of people will make as an argument and say, well, if you look at hospitals, they're not full of COVID patients and we're not seeing as many people dying. But this is what concerns me the most. I often say to my friends and family that personally, I feel the threat level now is higher than it ever was back in March. And the reason being, if we give the virus a bit of credit and say that it's a living species just like us, in fact viruses are some of the oldest living species on Earth. We don't know whether they existed at the same time as the first living organism or happened as a result of its first cell division, but they have to survive, and for a virus to survive it can't kill its host in 24 hours. That does nothing for the survival of a virus species. But what a virus will do very well is it'll adapt in a way whereby it will be transmitted highly amongst the highest number of people with the least amount of symptoms, so that they don't sort of stay away from other people, and thereby it improves its transmission rates. And we've seen this evolution with multiple viruses before in the past. And the other sort of reassuring figure that's being brandished about, which I think is highly worrying rather than reassuring, is that the majority of people testing positive are asymptomatic. So your NBA player who's having a random test before a game, they feel fine and they test positive, or recently several Italian footballers. But it's the young age group, and the young age group technically are what we call super spreaders. And it's not a question of their intent of them spreading the virus. It's the fact that their mobility, their general sort of lesser likelihood to maybe be as strict as some a bit older perhaps in terms of following guidelines. But really my concern is the threat that they carry in traveling into households, and that really can accelerate transmission rates. If anything, the rise in the number of young people, I think, is a sign of failure of our sort of public education and social education, because really we needed to get to them first, because we may be fighting this battle for another 5 years or so, but at some point those sort of 18, 20-year-olds who in the UK we had instances where schools were stopped and street parties were happening. Well, they need to kind of be the people asking the questions in 5 years' time about what needs to be done to control it. So I think the evidence is almost there for a second wave, and certainly the patterns that we've seen from other coronaviruses suggest that it's likely. I've also seen reports that said that considering MERS, SARS, now novel coronavirus 2, the rate of these coronaviruses is becoming pathogenic, which they exist in us in various forms. Some can even cause the common cold, is increasing, and some have even signaled that even if we get over COVID-19, that we may have another coronavirus to deal with within the next decade. So life may need to change in some ways to allow us to coexist. And I always refer to 1918 because they didn't have ventilators, they didn't have vaccines, they had a horrible pandemic. And although many lives were lost, people survived. And it's simple behavioral adaptations that are able to be made immediately and passed around communities very quickly that actually make the effective changes. Vaccines, as we've already seen, we've been waiting now for almost sort of in 8 or 9 months, and we're still facing a phenomenal amount of uncertainty. And so really one can argue if the vaccines fall flat on their face, the governments don't really have a plan B. But I don't want to get too political. I can easily do that.
All right. Well, thank you for that perspective. And thank you for coming on In the Green today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Making moves, machines with tools and drills, making grooves, missions impossible.
I am not a financial advisor, and my comment should never be taken as financial advice. Investments come with risk, so always do your research and analysis before.